This episode's going to seem a little different, but I've been on a break for a while and I'm back now with episode number 200. And I recorded all of this in one take. I just sat down and talked. I wrote out some thoughts ahead of time, but I didn't stop to do any editing. I'm not going to edit. I'm not going to take out pieces. There were a few bumbling things where I went off track, but this is my testimony. And so it's raw. It's like we sat down over coffee together. So come on in and listen. Welcome to Life Repurposed. This is where midlife meets inspiration, practical guidance, and renewed purpose amid life's evolving chapters. We navigate faith questions and messy, uncertain twists with humor and a commitment to pursue treasure, even in the hard stuff. I'm your host, Michelle Rayburn, the author of books and Bible studies about finding hope in the trashy stuff of life. I took a little break to move the podcast to a new platform. So we are now on Substack. So all of the articles I write and the content I put out in the podcast are all here on Substack. And so episode number 200 is the very first one released on this platform. Now, like I said, I've been on this little break. And can I just be honest with you? I know you can't answer, so I'm going to be honest with you. I'm feeling really worn out professionally. Even though I'm quite content in my personal life and I'm not dealing with constant internal angst, I just feel like I just don't want to do all the things anymore. So I really enjoyed having a break from podcasting, but I also missed podcasting. And so here I am, but I can't come with some fake enthusiasm and put on a show because this really isn't a show. It's an invitation to a conversation. And so I'm not here to entertain or to be fake. Sometimes the conversation is just with me and the thoughts that have been whirling around in my head. And other times it's a conversation with a guest that I invite you to be part of. But anyway, I'm here. Today it's just me. And this is episode number 200 of Life Repurposed. I thought about the possible ways that I could make a splash and celebrate episode 200. And I just couldn't do it. You're here looking for something of substance and not some sort of meta content where I just reflect on my feelings. So that said, I did decide to tell you a story about me, but I hope that you'll find some glimpses of yourself in there too, because our journeys run parallel and they intersect often on this journey we call life. Not too long ago, someone asked me if there's a place online where my story lives. Sometimes we call this a testimony. I don't really have a whole thing. There's pieces in different interviews that I've done on other people's podcasts. I've talked about pieces in my own. This is probably not going to be complete because we don't have time for that. But I have never sat down and attempted to just tell my faith journey. Frankly, most of the time, I don't think there's that much to tell. But in my process of sorting through my past experiences in faith communities and in my own process of learning to follow Jesus, and then all the things that I've picked up or discarded in that process, I hope you might find something that spurs you on. My story isn't complete, it's fluid, and yours is not complete either. You're still moving like I am and shifting and changing as God changes us. So we're going to meander a little bit today as we go on this journey. It's kind of like when you go for a leisurely drive and you roll down the windows. We'll take in some details along the way and we'll not do the speed version, but we're also going to get to a destination. We're not just going to sit here while you listen to me ponder and tell my entire history. But I will start with talking about where I was born. So I was born into a family that taught faith in Jesus from as young as I could remember. We went to church. We went to Sunday school. We went to everything that took place within the church doors whenever they were open. Prayer services, Sunday nights, Wednesday nights, revivals, VBS, special speakers, concerts. We were at church all the time. And my parents also read the Bible to us a lot at home. We prayed before every meal. My dad read from the Bible and did a devotion at every meal he was there for. My mom did our lunches sometimes when we were kids. So a spiritual teaching was also part of our life at home. And when we socialized, it was with family and church people mostly. I attended a Christian school all the way through 8th grade, 2 different schools. I'll talk about that in a moment. And I was also involved at church from a very young age. I sang, well, if you grew up in church, you know that it was called special music. We sang special numbers like a solo or something like that in the church service. And I was part of doing that with my parents and my siblings from a young age on the stage, participating in doing solos and things like that for Christmas programs and all of that. My parents baptized me as an infant. We were part of a Christian Reformed church until I was a teen. And I remember being in Sunday school as a young child and hearing the gospel and responding. Now, you'll have to look up a Christian Reformed church and all the different variations of Calvinism and Reformed theology. And there's so many of them. I'm not going to go into theology here, but I was born into a family that believed that faith was at the core of who we are. I wanted to follow Jesus and I wanted to please God. Somewhere along the way, that got sort of tangled up with following rules, and there was a high emphasis on God's justice and how he chooses a select few in these Calvinistic traditions. And again, I'm not going to go into all the theology of election and all of that, but in my own personal experience, the emphasis on like a grace that was special for certain people and this idea that God is heavy on justice, it really led to a lot of questioning and wondering if God chose me. So there were questions as I grew a little bit of like, what if my life isn't showing fruit? And by fruit, I mean like looking like Jesus or like a follower. Was I just going through the motions to make God happy? How do I know if he really loves me? And in all this tangling up process, I mistakenly believed that God would somehow love me more if I was good. And good is a word that now it just kind of makes me cringe. You know, when we use words like good and godly to talk about people, I always exercise caution because when we emphasize it in a certain way, well, I went into this in another episode. I won't get off on a whole tangent here. I'll spare you that tangent. But anyway, I talked about the difference between being good and godly and how we can sometimes just even misuse that term in another episode. I'll help you link to that in the show notes. Anyway, like I said, I've talked about that in other podcasts, but we were part of a church that preached the gospel and that there was nothing we could do to earn salvation. Okay, so that's what I learned. It's all God. There's nothing we do. I'm not going to go into free will and all that either here, but later on in life, I discovered that we do have a choice in the matter, even though God provides Jesus and he does all the work for us. But as a young person, the idea that we had to be good naturally led to living as if I had to work to earn God's favor. And that led to a lot of judgment of others who didn't work so hard. I'd look over and say, oh, look at them. They're not really following Jesus, are they? Like I would have made a really good church lady on Saturday Night Live. Dana Carvey. Anyway, so when I think about that and I think about how we preached the gospel and there's nothing we can do to earn salvation, but then we live as though we always have to measure up to this standard and there's rules and it just like kind of like piling on these rules. It just leaves you with exactly the opposite of what you learn. And so when you associate mostly with church friends and Christian school friends, it also creates borders and boundaries to keep out people who don't follow the rules. I didn't do a great job, though, of swallowing everything I was taught. I often questioned church tradition or teaching versus what scripture said. And this is because when our family moved away from my birthplace when I was 10, we moved to a town where there wasn't a school available in our tradition, not one that aligned perfectly with our church. So my parents decided to send us to really one of the only Christian school choices in town, and that was a Missouri Synod Lutheran school. And there, I learned very different things, a new perspective on some things, where I studied Luther's catechism at school, And then at home and in my doctrine classes in Sunday school, we were looking at things like the Westminster Catechism and the Heidelberg Catechism. And there were some crossovers like the Lord's Prayer and all those things that were part of our tradition. But there were some things that were different. And so I'm thankful for this mix because it brought new perspectives and it opened my thoughts to inspecting doctrine instead of just swallowing it right down. You know how when somebody hands you something and you pop it in and you eat it and you're like, oh, that was interesting. Well, we can do that with our faith too sometimes, where someone hands us something and we're like, oh, okay, I believe that too. And instead of pausing to look at what are we consuming? What are we taking in? Do I agree with it or not? I remember writing answers to questions in my 8th grade catechism class at church that indicated, this is what I know the answer is supposed to be. But then in the margin, I would say, I actually think it ought to be this. And I know this because I've kept some of these papers and I found them in some of my mementos downstairs in a box. So this didn't really score very high on the popularity points with the minister who taught this class because I was questioning a lot of things. But again, it grew my faith because I was doing more examination. My parents were on their own path away from the tradition of our upbringing. And, I didn't know. When you're a kid, you don't really know your parents are also kind of doing some exploring. We had some conversations, but not a lot of them. But they did discuss with us some of the differences between what we learned at school and at church. When I was 15, they took us to an evangelical free church to visit on some Sunday evenings. Because, if you're going to visit somewhere else, you got to still be in your church on Sunday morning. But then it started to become some Sunday mornings, too, where we were visiting. And I began to pick up new flavors. Now, alongside the Calvinistic teachings and the teachings of Luther, I had some evangelical flavors to consider. I grew up in a church that was Stoic, and the Lutheran church where I went to school and had chapel was the same. You entered in silence. The organ played. You sang along with one music leader or a choir. You exited quietly. You didn't socialize in the sanctuary. When my parents took us to the evangelical free church, it was loud and boisterous and people were all over the sanctuary until someone called them to order and started the service. There was a lot of fellowship and just a whole different experience of church. One where there might be somebody walking around with a microphone to do prayer requests. And that was not part of something I had in my background. So there was this woman who had mentored me as a Sunday school teacher from around age 10 to 15. And when my parents started attending the new church, she also was visiting the church at the same time we did. She knew some people from the church, and so she was also exploring a bit. Now, here's where we're going to take a little side trip on this road trip just for a second. This friend, Christine, knew my family, and she also knew my husband's family. I didn't know my husband, but she worked with my husband's dad. He's not my husband. He wasn't then. If that all makes sense to you, then you're tracking way better than I am. So she had decided that if these two youngsters, me and my husband, would ever meet, that we would hit it off. So it just so happened that their family attended that evangelical free church that we started attending. And my husband's mother spotted us on our first Sunday morning, scooted across the church, and had her son take me off to Sunday school class. And that was how we met. And then we started dating by the time I was 16, and we got married in that church when I was 20. Okay, back to the real story. Just had to give you that little side story of how I met my husband at church. So leaving the Reformed tradition was really hard for my family. There were arguments within the family, not in our nuclear family living at home, but in the extended family. We were the first people to do that. The uncles and aunts and grandpa and grandma, everybody was of the same tradition. So there were arguments in family. There were some friendships that were severed when we left the church. It didn't go well. Some churches are we're all part of the same team. We wish you well. And other ones are angry when you leave. And so there was a little mix, and there were some friendships that were severed in the middle of all of that. And, people just don't like it when you leave the gates and you explore something new. So my parents experienced some of that. And I remember experiencing some with some of my teen friends as well. And so there were some friendships that I kept and some that didn't stick it out through that change. It didn't go well when I also mentioned to my grandparents that I was going to be baptized at age 16 after attending a youth conference, because you remember I was baptized as an infant. And that conference was a pivotal moment for me in committing to follow Jesus again. And I really wanted baptism as a teen to be a symbol of that commitment. I was essentially affirming what my parents wanted for me as a baby. And now I was making the choice for myself, and I was making a public declaration of that choice. And my parents were also baptized with me at that time. So along that whole process of deciding I wanted as a teen to commit to follow Christ again, I also still continued to struggle with the idea of grace. Perfectionism has always been a big part of my life, and the following of rules continued. It didn't just go away. I was so used to following rules. And again, I'm not blaming anybody, because almost every tradition I've been part of as a Christian has had some sort of rule following involved. So I'm not pointing fingers or blaming, but the evangelical free church had its own version of fundamentalism. So, no dances, no playing cards, no drinking, purity culture, all that stuff. And so there's just a new version of following rules, heavier on grace, lighter on the justice, more of a good blend of who God is. But I struggled to accept that. I knew that God loved me, and I wondered if he loved me. Does that make sense? Like, something to be true, and yet you wonder if it's true. That's the wrestling that we do. When it's hard to accept grace, it's hard to accept the truth about who we are. So after getting baptized, I was bolder about my faith at school. I started to share the gospel with friends at lunch or at work or riding in the car, or riding on the bus. So I was bolder in talking about faith, and I knew that following Christ was really important to me. And I knew it was more than just following rules, but there was this whole process of learning about what that meant. I really wanted to attend a Christian college, but it was so expensive, and I came from a farm family, and that was not going to happen. So I chose to attend a state college and got involved with Campus Crusade for Christ, which is now called Cru, immediately. On the day I arrived on campus, I went to a picnic, met people, my RA introduced me to people, and I have formed lifelong friendships because of that. And many parts of that experience offered growth for me. I was participating in Bible studies, leading and also being in Bible studies. I had long discussions about faith matters with friends and mentors. There was a gal from Cru who mentored me, and we spent a lot of time talking. And that was just really explosive for my own spiritual growth, being away from home for the first time and learning how to apply my faith in the context of real life outside of the bubble. We went door to door with Cru, and we used this booklet called The Four Spiritual Laws. And now looking back, I think this wasn't a great idea. And I'm sorry if you're still involved in Cru and you use that. It really has a good intention, but there's this bridge diagram, and you talk about the penalty of sin and how Jesus paid our penalty, and that part is good, but then it was also kind of heavy on the penalty and punishment part too, and it was really about just hoping for a response from somebody that they would say, yes, I want to follow Jesus, and then sometimes there was follow-up, sometimes not, and so I got a little numbers oriented with it. And really looking back, my biggest challenge with it was that I remember knocking on dorm doors. We just went and knocked on doors to see if people would talk with us. And there were many times where I felt judgy and kind of disgusted about the choices that people make or made when they were in college. And looking back now, I can see that I just really wanted to fix people, but I don't think I had true compassion. Obviously, there's a maturity thing there that hadn't caught up, and my heart just was in the right place with the right desire, but how I carried it out was just not there. But again, it was part of my journey. It was part of who I am, so I'm not going to erase that. It's there. Okay, so speeding up a little bit. I got married at Christmas in my junior year of college, finished college and everything, but we were married during that time. Now I'm going to speed up because this is kind of like driving through Iowa and Nebraska. And so we just want to get to the other side. So, a summary of my biggest spiritual struggles from the time I was like young married to when I had preteen children of my own. I got really tied up in body and weight with spiritual teaching, like the teachings on gluttony and idolatry and all that really got tangled up in there. I no longer see things the way I did before, but I attended Bible studies that focused on pleasing God, and I shamed myself for not measuring up. And it was this self-improvement thing, and that's just where I was at, something that I was really struggling with and feeling the shame. Okay, I said I was speeding this up, so we're not gonna dwell there. Another episode. I've talked about that before. I also strongly believed in keeping out bad people and surrounding myself with all things Christian. So when I became a mom, I wanted to make sure we kept all that stuff out of our house. My political views were strongly tied to believing there was only one party to vote for and only a few issues that mattered. And I believed you couldn't be a Christian if you didn't vote the way I voted. I served as a Bible study leader, a children's leader, worship director, and more. I was very involved, continued the habits my parents established of being very involved in church. We were immersed in church life and raising children, and we went to church with my parents and my husband's parents. Okay, we got through Iowa and Nebraska. Now let's look at the mountains. I was a stay-at-home mom in my 30s when my husband took a full-time ministry role at a Bible camp. It meant raising support like a missionary and moving away. It was the first time in my life that I didn't attend church with any of our family. We got to pick our church, not where our parents went. We got to pick. I was also at that same time enrolled in some online classes with Crown College, a missionary and alliance university. And I really wanted to do something more ministry-wise than just the speaking and teaching that I was doing. So I was in these classes, these leadership classes. And when we moved, we started attending a Baptist church. Now you can see some more flavors coming into my story. I really resisted attending that church because I wanted something different. It was so much like the traditional fundamentalist things that I had been part of for so much of my life. But it was a good place for our family. It was small and it was local and it really fit the needs for my preteens to get to know people and go to school with friends. And it taught the Bible and I could get involved and my husband could be involved. So we went there for 8 years. I started writing more, and God was really working on me in my studies. I was speaking for women's events and writers' conferences often, and looking back, I can see that I was still the fixer from my college years. I spoke at people instead of with or to. I told them what they should do. Pride, of course, comes in there. And my own spiritual pedigree was really part of it. Like being proud of your own pedigree is definitely a thing. And so you can be motivated to do a good thing, and you can still have this undertone of doing the wrong thing, if that makes sense. And so God put some mountains there to help me understand love and grace. It stopped me. It was like I had to really look, and I could see some beautiful things and some ugly things and some stuff that God and I really had to work on. And in the middle of that, I don't remember when it was. It was such a gradual process of change that I can't give you specific dates. It's like God has just been adjusting the course until I'm moving in a different direction. And I remember seeing Luke 18, verses 19 through 14, and having it hit me in a brand new way. I heard this story so many times, saw the flannel graphs when I was a kid, but here's what it says. I've shared it before, but I want you to hear this because this speaks to me still now. This is a parable Jesus told. To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, and I give 1/10 of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but he beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And then I realized that I was that Pharisee. And I know it can sound like I'm condemning people who still identify as Pharisees. This is not disparaging to Jewish people at all. I'm saying that in the mindset of that person in that parable, that was me. I looked at others and I told God I was glad I wasn't like them. I condemned them, and I'd been doing it from the time I was in college. And the box broke open, and I saw the boundaries that I was sitting inside, and my raw heart was right there. And I wanted to go back and undo some things from the past, but I could only move forward. God has shown me that I can have relationships with people who don't believe in Jesus, that I can have conversations with people who think differently. I can love people who think differently. The gospel has taken on a whole new light when I see that Jesus wants a relationship with his followers, and he wants us to abide in him so that we can become like him. We conform to him and his cross, and we love others how he loved. The more I looked at Jesus, the more I saw that I wasn't following him. I followed the Pharisees. I modeled my life after them, the rule setters, the ones imposing huge burdens on people to conform. They were well-intentioned religious purists. They thought they were doing the right thing, and I could relate to that. This idea that I'm trying to protect the right thing and keep out the bad thing. But Jesus' compassion shattered all of that. And when God shook me up, he was doing a work in my husband too. Eventually, we ended up at a Wesleyan church for 9 years, and we have recently felt God nudging us to a new place. So that spiritual pedigree is really messed up. I can't take a label. I'm not a Calvinist. I'm not a Lutheran. I'm not a Baptist. I'm not a Wesleyan or a fundamentalist. I'm a Christian. I'm a person who follows Jesus. The process of what many people call deconstruction, of sorting through and untangling, is still ongoing. It isn't tearing it down and ruining it. I haven't walked away from faith, but I've walked away from some old beliefs. I love Jesus more than ever before. I now believe it's my role to be like Jesus, but it isn't my job to make sure every person conforms to Christianity. That's the Holy Spirit's job. I know that in my lifetime, I'm going to rub shoulders with a lot of people who don't believe in Jesus. And I don't have to run away and put myself in a box and stay away. I can be exactly who he created me to be right there in the midst of all the things that we do. I no longer see just one political party for Christians. I know Christians who vote in all sorts of ways. That topic gets a little uncomfortable in some of my old circles, but we're managing it. I also understand that there are churches that teach doctrines that I don't agree with. They're not bad people. We have this diversity and we can still love Jesus. We can agree on the important things and know that there's just some practices that don't match up the same. The Calvinists in the church, the tradition I was born in, definitely don't line up with the way I think now, but I know they still love Jesus. If you knew me way back then, like back when I started speaking or back when I was going door to door, I'm sorry for being the prideful know-it-all that you knew me to be. No, I know there were some glimpses of something under there that were more tender, and some of you saw that, and you know that I wasn't all judgy. But now it's broke open. It's raw. It hurts sometimes, and I don't know how to fix it. Each day, I can only ask Jesus to help me figure it all out. I want to be welcoming to the struggling person. I want to love Jesus more than loving my life or my country. I love being in America, but I don't love America more than Jesus. To know that my eternal home is not here, then I know that my purpose is not to lecture others, but to love them. If you're struggling with guilt and heaping a lot of shame on yourself trying to measure up, I want you to listen to what the Apostle Paul said. The Apostle Paul was a Pharisee. And God got a hold of his heart and really changed him. And so that's why his words are so meaningful to me when I see them. In Romans 8, starting at verse 1, he said, "So now there is no condemnation for those who belong to Christ Jesus. And because you belong to him, the power of the life-giving Spirit has freed you from the power of sin that leads to death. The law of Moses was unable to save us because of the weakness of our sinful nature. So God did what the law could not do. He sent his own Son in a body like the bodies we sinners have. And in that body, God declared an end to sin's control over us by giving us his Son as a sacrifice for our sins. He did this so that the just requirement of the law would be fully satisfied for us, who no longer follow our sinful nature, but instead follow the Spirit. Those who are dominated by the sinful nature think about sinful things, but those who are controlled by the Holy Spirit think about things that please the Spirit. So letting your sinful nature control your mind leads to death, but letting the Spirit control your mind leads to life and peace. Paul paints a picture there of a transformation and what happens when God gets a hold of us. I had a performance-based outlook when I was a young woman, and I still fight with it. I learned that if I couldn't fit in with my peers, I would work on fitting in with my teachers. I mistakenly believed, like I said, that what I achieved is what defined me as good enough. Or I thought if I was perfect enough, I'd be acceptable to people and then acceptable to God. But the problem with all of this is that it puts the focus on me. The focus needs to be on the cross, on Jesus. Life isn't perfect, and I'm not perfect, but God is perfect. One verse that brings me comfort is knowing that God fills in all the gaps where I'm a mess. And again, it's the Apostle Paul who says this. He had asked God to take away this thing that was tormenting him. We don't know what it is, but God said to him in 2 Corinthians 12, "My grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness." And Paul's response was, "So now I am glad to boast about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ can work through me." This is the only kind of boasting we can do. We accept free grace given by Jesus as enough, and then we reflect his goodness, we reflect his perfection, and reflect his light. In all our trying to be enough, we miss the point that God is enough and that God makes us enough too. You are enough because of Jesus. I am enough because of Jesus. We are enough in him. Because of his goodness, we don't have to search and figure it out inside of ourselves. And God's grace isn't reserved for perfect people who live up to some certain standard. It's applied to our imperfection and then makes us complete. I've learned in my life that my flaws don't disqualify me from making a difference for the sake of God's kingdom, and yours don't either. Your past doesn't have to define you, and the darkness doesn't have to consume you. We often define people by their worst mistakes. That's the Pharisaical mindset. Oh, I know that person. Remember when she did blah, blah, blah? But God sees us through grace when we're committed to him, and so we boast about our weaknesses. And with the Apostle Paul, we say, "I take pleasure in my weakness, for when I am weak, then I am strong." So that's where I am. It's kind of lonely sometimes outside the boundaries. My core beliefs are solid, but questioning the system doesn't make a person popular in a church that likes the system. Thank you very much. Well, that was not a 1-minute testimony. You want that? Here you go. I have loved Jesus my whole life, but I spent most of it worrying about rules and legalistic systems of belief instead of just abiding in Jesus and bearing the fruit of love. And so my goal now is to abide in Jesus. How's that? That's a life repurposed. When I look back, all of that is part of who I am today. There's so many parts of the story. I couldn't tell it all to you, but I don't want to condemn or cut it out because it's what makes me who I am. Yes, I would like to undo some things, but it's all part of how I got here. And so the thing that God's been putting on my mind right now, and the thing I've been working on is I'm working on a new Bible study that is way, way delayed. And I've just been wrestling with what does it mean to be in Jesus? What does it mean to follow him? And as I've been studying John 15, it has really spoken to me. And so as I wrap up today, this is where God's leading me right now. He's teaching me what it means to abide. And so from John 15, some verses in the words of Jesus, he says, "I am the true grapevine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch of mine that doesn't produce fruit, and he prunes the branches that do bear fruit so they will produce even more. You have already been pruned and purified by the message I have given you. Remain in me, and I will remain in you. For a branch cannot produce fruit if it is severed from the vine, and you cannot be fruitful unless you remain in me. Now, before I go further, this illustration, it's speaking to me because my whole life in the judgy form I was in, I was thinking, he takes all those branches of bad people and he cuts them off and discards them, and he keeps the special ones. And as I look at this, I see that he's talking about me. He's talking about my branches, and he's saying, I cut off the ones that don't bear fruit, and I prune you so that you bear fruit and produce even more. And so what I was looking at this from a mindset of like what he's doing to other people, and he's saying, I prune you. You are the branches, and you need to remain in the grapevine. He continues, Jesus says, yes, I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who remain in me and I in them will produce much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. Anyone who does not remain in me is thrown away like a useless branch and withers. Such branches are gathered into a pile to be burned. But if you remain in me and my words remain in you, you may ask for anything you want and it will be granted. When you produce much fruit, you are my true disciples. This brings great glory to my Father. All right, now I'm not going to even touch the you can ask for anything you want and it will be granted, because I don't believe in any prosperity gospel. So I'm not going to take it to that application. And when I talk about asking for anything you want, there's just so much more to that. We have to talk about asking in God's will and all that. So, okay, we won't talk about that right now. But I do want to talk about the branches because, again, I spent a lot of time thinking, oh, what if I get cut off and thrown away because I'm not really part of God's family? And you know what he says? He says, remain in me. Remain in me. I'll remain in you, and you will produce fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. And here I was trying apart from him to do all these things, and I was trying to be a good person. And he's saying, just remain in me. It's not about what you're doing. It's about you staying with me. That's what keeps you connected to the vine. I thought, wow, I've made this a lot more complicated than it needed to be. And then Jesus wraps up that section and he says, I have loved you even as the Father has loved me. Remain in my love. When you obey my commandments, you remain in my love, just as I obey my Father's commandments and remain in his love. I have told you these things so that you will be filled with my joy. Yes, your joy will overflow. And here's the key. He says this. This is my commandment. Love each other in the same way I have loved you. There is no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you slaves because a master doesn't confide in his slaves. Now you are my friends, since I have told you everything the Father told me. You didn't choose me. I chose you. I appointed you. And he's saying this to his disciples. He chose them to go and produce lasting fruit so that the Father will give you whatever you ask for using my name. And then he says, this is my command. Love each other. Now, these are the instructions he gave to his disciples right before he went to the cross. And you know, he's talking about what's going to come, and it's going to be tough. And he's telling them, I chose you to be my disciples. And you know, when we look at this picture, we can say he wants us to be his followers too. He wants us to remain in him. And he says the command is to love each other. And that passage talks about the fruit of remaining in Jesus being love. And so the number one thing that I've been focusing on right now is remaining in Jesus and asking him to produce love as the fruit. I still wrestle with all my imperfections. My husband knows how flawed I truly am when it comes to loving in my imperfect way. But God is constantly working on me. And this is our testimony that we remain in Jesus. And the fruit of that is love. The fruit of that is not all the other things that we think it might be. It's purely love. And you know, that can happen outside of the walls of a church. We love people in our community when we're remaining in Jesus. We love people at work and in our family. And so that is the fruit. Remain in Jesus and we will produce love. I got on a little bit of a soapbox there, but man, when I start talking about love, I get passionate because this has been the biggest gap in my life. So if you look at the summary of my entire testimony, it's that I'm learning how to remain. And I still don't have a perfect answer for what that means, but Jesus sure makes it sound pretty simple here. Just stay. Just stay in him, and he stays with us, and then we love people. So that's my testimony, the long and the short of it. And I want to thank you for being here for episode number 200, because this is Life Repurposed, and God is continually repurposing my life. And so love is a big product of that repurposing. And so I encourage you to take a look at where God can produce more love in you. Maybe you have a story like mine where you have been struggling with trying to be perfect, or been struggling with judging people, been struggling with feeling guilt or shame, all of those things. And so I hope this is your opportunity to just ask God to take a look and see what he needs to prune away so that he can produce that love in you. Thanks for being here, and I will see you soon with another episode. Thanks for listening to Life Repurposed. Would you like more? Check out the Life Repurposed magazine on Substack and get resources, weekly musings, and conversations with others. Just go to liferepurposed.me.